Welcome to the Melanin Jelly Project Conversations, a podcast that celebrates diversity and representation in children's storytelling, entertainment, and edutainment. I am the host, Olunosen Louisa Ivaze. On this podcast, I chat with authors and creators of children's books, entertainment, and edutainment. This is also a collaboration with the Ottawa Black Book Club. So I would like to welcome Brunella Costagliola. Brunella Costagliola, to the author of A Stroke of Magic, The Dinosaur Woman.
Yes.
So I'd like to welcome Brunella to the Melanin Jelly Project Conversations podcast. My name is Louisa Olunosen Ivaze. I am the host and also the founder of the Ottawa Black Book Club. I put together this podcast because I feel that we don't have enough podcasts that celebrate representation in children and diversity in children's storytelling. So, Brunella, tell me about yourself and what inspired you to write this lovely book.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me on your podcast. As soon as I heard of the existence of your podcast, I jumped at the opportunity to be a part of it because you're absolutely right. There is not much conversation around the importance of representation and diversity in children's literature. So again, thank you so much for having me. My name, as you mentioned, is Brunella, and I was born and raised in Bacoli, which is a small coastal town in the south of Naples, in the south of Italy, close to Naples. And I am an immigrant. I immigrated to the United States of America about 9 years ago.
Okay.
And as a writer and as a mother, I have felt the need to contribute diversity to children's books, not only because it's important for children to see themselves represented in children's books, but also because it opens a conversation, it starts a conversations among adults as well, and that is crucial.
Okay. And so when I started reading the book, I noticed, what I loved about it was I noticed a lot of words that are not English in the book. And you just wrote a straight story. So tell us about your inspiration for this book. Tell us about this book and what you hoped, why you chose to tell this kind of story.
Yes, indeed. There are 4 different languages in this book. There's, of course, English, then Spanish, Italian, and Hebrew. Mm-hmm. The inspiration for this book actually came from my illustrator. His name is Valerio Mazzoli. He's also Italian, and he also immigrated to the US. We actually both live in Florida, and we've been great friends for about 5 years now. Okay. He showed me, after we worked together on another children's book for a mutual client, he showed me a drawing that he had of 3 children, 1 grandpa, and they were among dinosaurs. Okay. So he asked me, can you write a story about this drawing? And I said, I would love to. And that's the book. That's how the story turned out to be. It was 3 children, 1 grandfather, and dinosaurs. But as I was writing the book, what I really focused on was how can I contribute to a much bigger and more important conversation than simply writing yet another children's book. And I remember working with a wonderful client of mine because aside from being an author, I'm also a ghostwriter and editor. And I've been working in the publishing industry here in the US for the past 10 years. I actually have my own boutique writing and editing agency called the Military Editor Agency, where we cater exclusively to military authors and military related manuscripts. Mm-hmm. So as I was working for a client of mine who needed my help with her children's book, she told me of her story as an Afro-Panamanian woman living in New York and how hard it was for her to find Afro-Panamanian characters in children's books. Okay. So it gave me that idea of there's truly not much about Afro-Panamanian culture in children's books. Okay. And then, of course, being Italian myself, I have 2 Italian-American children. I wanted to include my culture and, representing Italian culture and Italian-American culture in the book as well. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to open up the conversation not only to cultural diversity, but also religious. And that is the reason why one of our characters is Jewish. And aside from the diversity, what I also wanted to contribute to was bringing to the forefront historical figures that have been previously lost to history amnesia. And that is the reason why I incorporated the historical figure of Mary Anning. She was a paleontologist and scientist in the early 1800s in England, but because of her gender, her many discoveries that have contributed to even Charles Darwin's theories have been wrongfully attributed to male scientists for so many years. So what I decided to do, having all these pieces together, I thought, why not create not just one children's book, but an entire series that focuses on highlighting not just cultural diversity, but also historical figures that have been, as I said, previously lost to history, perhaps because of their gender or because of their race, or maybe they were immigrants and didn't have the same rights. So their discoveries and their contributions have been lost. The reason why I decided to also incorporate all of that, and the way I incorporated that was through art. Art to me is, of course, an umbrella term, but in this case, art is also a character in the book. He is the painter in the book that you can also see in the cover. And Art, he's our Jewish character, he paints the truth. And why does he paint the truth? Because unfortunately we live in an era where we have to deal with censorship in books and banned books. So I wanted Art not to write a book about it and risk censorship. I wanted Art to paint the truth. So the three children, the three protagonists, two Italian-American twins and one Afro-Panamanian girl, her name is Lila, and the twins' names are Alex and Ella. They jump into this painting thanks to the magical paintbrush Jeanette, and they travel back in time and meet Mary Anning. With every book, they're going to jump in a painting, travel back in time, and meet a historical figure so they can learn the truth about the historical figure and what he or she contributed to history.
Oh, that's very beautiful. I think you are very right. It's like I was doing some research on African heroes and heroines, and part of what I found out from what I was reading is that there's a lot of misrepresentation. A lot of some of the heroes were actually women, but because at that time women were not seen in that light, through the years the stories have been changed and have been changed to stories of men, in quotes.
Yes.
Yeah, so those women are completely lost in history. We don't know what their real names are. We know what they did, but we don't, many we don't still know were women. We just assume they were all men.
Right.
Great warriors, because I feel that they are just things that people don't just expect women to do. But yeah, but there are women who, who veer outside the norm and do really great things. So I couldn't help but notice that you had mentioned when they met, I think Abuelita, where she said food is culture. Speak to us about that.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, I think it started as something about Italian culture and how I left my home country to come live in another country. And while adjusting and trying to assimilate into American culture, in order to fit in, I started thinking, why do I have to fit in? Why not bring my uniqueness and my Italian culture and add it to the beautiful mosaic that is the United States of America? So I did that at the beginning. When I'm not writing children's books, I love to cook. And I come from a family where all the women cook. And we have legends associated to every meal for every special occasion. We have history that we can tell through a meal that we prepare. And all of that I brought with me to the US. And of course, cooking for my children, I make sure that I explain why we make this specific dessert, for example, for Easter, or that specific meal for Christmas.
Okay.
And so it's through food that I'm able to also convey what it is to be in Southern Italian or Italian in general. So for me, food is culture for me, and it's not just something unique to Italian. I believe it's something across every single country, every culture. We communicate through food. We leave legacy through food. We tell stories through food. So for me, food is just as important as the written word.
Okay, thank you. And you used symbolism, where here you said a fun fact: a turtle or honu in Polynesian culture is a symbol of health, peace, and longevity in life, among many other positive meanings. How important is symbolism to cultures?
Again, just like food, I think it's crucial. And I was lucky enough to have, that's something else that we also need to talk about, is cultural accuracy. We can't simply assume that if we read something on the internet, or even if we research something on the internet about somebody else's culture, it means it's true. In my opinion, cultural accuracy and hiring and contributing and working with cultural accuracy readers when writing about another culture that perhaps we don't know much about is important. So for that specific line that you just read, I engaged the help of a friend of mine who is Polynesian, and she was able to explain to me what the symbolism behind a turtle tattoo is, though she shared with me a much broader explanation, beautiful explanation behind the symbolism of tattoos in Polynesian culture. So to me, symbolism is just as important as food. Food is part of a symbol, right? Mm-hmm. So communicating a culture through our symbols or through our food, and then translate all of that into the written word, to me, that is one of the most important ways to leave a legacy and to keep the conversation going, and also to be able to share the truth about cultures.
Okay. I don't really know a lot about Afro-Panamanians, but when I was reading here, I discovered that they have Congolese ancestry. Where
Yes.
In our Congolese culture, red symbolizes the chamuco.
Mm-hmm.
So symbolism, because when the way you describe the dress, I thought it would be, when you talk of bright colors, red always comes to mind.
Of course.
But from here I saw that red was not part of the. Wait, let me go back to the cover and see what color is there. Oh, it's pink and orange. Okay.
Pink and orange.
Orange. Yes, there's no red there.
Right. Yeah, there's no red there. And once again, because I don't know enough about Afro-Panamanian culture to be able to write it on my own, I engaged the help of a cultural accuracy reader. Her name is Blanca, and she is co-owner of the Panama Folklore in Seattle. So she identifies as part of the Afro-Panamanian heritage and culture, and she helped me with the representation of not only Laila, our Afro-Panamanian girl character, but also with her abuelita. And it's through abuelita and the importance of also listening to your elders, communicating with your elders, is something I wanted to highlight in my book. And that is the reason why most conversations in the book don't happen between children and mother or children and father, but they happen between children and grandparents.
Yeah, because those are the keepers of the knowledge, right?
Exactly, yes. And in a world where we often tend to leave our grandparents behind, or perhaps just not really take care of them the same way that, for example, our parents used to, I also wanted to remind readers, look how incredible it is when the grandparent has an honest conversation with their grandchildren about culture. They are the keepers of our heritage. We can't dismiss them.
So what are some of the challenges you think authors encounter when trying to tell authentic stories? What were some of the okay, let me put it to you. What were some of the challenges you experienced when you were trying to tell this story? Because you have cultures, you have religions, you have different races. I don't think it was easy to write, to keep track. So what were some of the challenges you experienced while writing this book?
Well, first and foremost, I did not want to fall in any assumptions or stereotypes. That is the reason why I wanted to create this children's book series, was to fight against stereotypes. Okay. When I came to the United States as an Italian immigrant, I was, I guess, they didn't know how to interact with me. People didn't know how to interact with me. They asked me questions that really left me wondering if it was a form of racism. They would point fingers at me, ask me questions about perhaps the ways that Italians have been represented in Hollywood movies. They made assumptions about me and my life based on, say, the trilogy The Godfather. And Lord. Right. So I wanted to assimilate into American culture because I wanted to fit in, but at the same time I thought, I don't have to fit in. I actually have a baggage, a cultural baggage that I can bring here and contribute to a much broader, much bigger, and more important conversation without having to fit in. So my biggest challenge, having been victim of stereotypes, my challenge was not to fall victim once again within my book or to victimize other cultures within my book. So the first thing I did was I asked the experts. What I did was I reached out to the Panama Folklore in Seattle so they could help me create the characters of Laila and Abuelita. They are the experts of the Afro-Panamanian culture, so I relied on their help. When it came to representing my Jewish character, I did the same thing. I reached out to a dear friend of mine who's Jewish, and he helped me create this character. When I created Ella and Alex, the Italian American children, I relied on my cultural experience, on my cultural baggage and heritage. And I also based these two characters on my two children, Alexander and Rosella. Okay. So relying on and reaching out, branching out to people who are part of that cultural heritage, to me, is important, is crucial, actually. As an author, we need to help one another, and we need to know that when we represent a culture that is beyond our own field of expertise, or that is a culture we do not associate with or identify with, we need to reach out to those who know better.
That's very true. That's very true. Because some people just sit down and make assumptions of cultures, and then they write, and in so doing, they end up misrepresenting those cultures.
Yes.
So why did you choose to self-publish your book? I think you self-published it. Why did you choose to self-publish it?
Actually, my publisher is W Brand Publishing, and they are a hybrid publisher. Okay. I have had previous authors of mine, clients of mine, who have published with her, and they had a beautiful experience. The reason why I chose W Brand Publishing, which is based in Tennessee, is because the owner, Julie Brand, my publisher, truly saw the meaning behind the story. She believed in my characters, she believed in my message, and she wanted to be the person who helped me put this book out into the world, along, of course, with my amazing illustrator. So that is the reason why I specifically chose W Brand Publishing.
Okay, so some listeners might be wondering what hybrid publishing is. Can you kindly explain that?
Of course. So hybrid publishing is a type of independent publisher, which means is not a traditional publisher. A traditional publisher is, for example, HarperCollins or Penguin Random House, just to name a couple of them. And
okay. And also, I see that you are a ghostwriter. A lot of people wonder what ghostwriters do. Can you also explain to us what ghostwriters do?
Of course. As a ghostwriter, I offer my writing skills to people who have a story to tell, but don't have the time or perhaps the skills to do so. So when it comes to hiring a ghostwriter, which is something that many celebrities, for example, do, most of them recently have been very open about them hiring a ghostwriter. For example, Prince Harry, he was very open and honest about having a ghostwriter write his memoir, Spare. And as a ghostwriter, what I do is I help my authors tell their stories in their own voice, meaning I get to know my authors very well. I get to know the story. And what I do is I write the story in their own voice so that people who know them and who are familiar with the way they speak, perhaps they have a word that they say often, they are able to see that the person, their friend or their family member, was the one actually writing the story without having questions or doubts about who wrote the story. A good ghostwriter is able to write the story without leaving thumbprints.
Okay, because that was one question I had. Because when you're writing on behalf of someone, how do you keep that voice authentic? So now you've explained it to me, because that's always been one of my questions. I keep going, if I use a ghostwriter, will the ghostwriter write the way I will write? So I think it's a skill. It's a skill.
It is a skill, indeed. Of course, as authors, we have our own voice. But when it comes to ghostwriting other people's stories, you have to take your own voice, often your own opinions also, out of that project. This is not your story. This is not your project. You have to respect the author's voice and understand that they are the authors. You are not. You're just the person who writes the story on their behalf.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges you think diverse authors face when trying to tell authentic stories? What are some of the challenges?
I think often racism.
Okay.
I think the publishing industry, I'm glad to see that in the past few years, many publishers have been more open to representing and publishing, for example, people of color and stories about people of color. I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see that there is a conversation there, but it's still not enough. And I think so often, because of who holds the power in the publishing industry. Let's not forget that a few years ago, the publishing industry, at least here in the States, was made 80% of white men. So as an immigrant, I tried to have the book being published by a traditional publisher. Had I had my book tried to be published by a traditional publisher, probably I wouldn't have had great luck. So I think, because as I said a few years ago, had I published this book a few years ago, or had I written this book a few years ago, maybe a traditional publisher wouldn't have been interested, because perhaps I talked about too many different cultures, or perhaps my protagonists did not have blonde hair, blue eyes. And it's a conversation that is present here in the US, but is also very much hushed.
Okay.
So it's something that I find it is improving. We are indeed improving within the publishing industry, but there's so much more work ahead of us. And that is why I'm such a big supporter of organizations and charities and events like the Multicultural Children's Book Day. That's why I'm such a big supporter. Diversity books. We need diverse books. It's important, because otherwise we're going to be stuck in the same place for the next 20 years. The books we write are the books that help raise our children. So let's have our children be able to see themselves in books, and not just about cultural diversity. Also neurodiversity is crucial to me. Perhaps also, different gender identities and different ways that children are able to express themselves. It's not just about culture or religion, it's also about gender representation, and it's also about neurodiversity.
Okay. I like that you said that the books that we write are the books that help raise our children, because for the longest time, what we didn't have enough diverse books on the shelves.
Yeah.
The only books at the time, the only books we had that had to do with diversity were either textbooks, and even in those textbooks, the representation wasn't right. I remember that a school board in the US was complaining about a textbook that said the textbook was talking about the slave trade, and the textbook didn't explain that the people were forcefully taken from the African continent and brought to the Americas. Instead, it said the Africans came. They didn't come. They were taken. Yes, they didn't come. They were kidnapped. They were forced and brought to the Americas to work. And sold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that you're very right in what you said makes a lot of sense. The books that we write help to raise our children.
Yes, and I think also the way that we explain certain things, just like you were talking about, I'm a firm believer that we shouldn't use the word slave, because slave is a noun, and it almost assumes that the person willingly took that role, like mother, father, teacher. No, they were enslaved. That's very different. It was something imposed onto them. It wasn't something anybody raised their hand and said, oh, sure, I'll be a teacher, I'll be a slave. Absolutely not. So I think the words that we use to explain these very important concepts to our children matter just as much as the way we represent them in children's books.
Yeah, that's true. How do you, so as diverse authors, how do you think we can put our voices out there? How do you think we can influence, sorry to interrupt, how do you think we can influence bookstores to carry our books and publishers to want to publish our stories? How do you think we can do that?
By supporting one another. You having me on your podcast is a major step toward a more diverse children's literature in the future. Me being able to ask for help when it comes to properly and respectfully representing other cultures that are not part of my heritage, and people being willing to help me, is how we support and we can move forward. Physically going to a bookstore, perhaps our local independent bookstore, and explain the reason why we are so passionate about the message we share in our children's book is equally important. There are, here in the States, we're lucky to have, for example, February is African American Heritage Month. So we celebrate, we have more conversation about African American culture, history, voices. We have conversations about Black American history, Black American culture, and so forth. So next month, March, is going to be Women's Month, Women's History Month. And we could have a conversation about Mary Anning, for example, and why her voice for so long and her name and her discoveries were pushed to the background and were credited to male scientists. What happened in the early 1800s to force Mary Anning to stay secluded in the background, and how can we learn from what happened back then so that we don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again? How can we ensure that female scientists, female politicians, and female voices in general across the world are no longer silenced or credited to male counterparts in the future? And I believe it starts with each and every book.
Yeah, okay, so I'm looking at your characters, and I'm going back to your book, and I'm looking at the characters, Alex, Ella, and Lila. So why a set of twins? Why not two boys? Why not two girls? Why not just a boy or just a girl? Why a set of twins?
I wanted to have a set of twins because I thought, as far as age is concerned, children read up. So I wanted Alex and Ella to both be 7 years old, so my target audience could see themselves in them. I didn't want one to be older than the other, although we do have Lila, who's 6 years old, and they all attend the same school, but they never met one another until they go to Discovery Casa, which is a retirement home, a fictionalized retirement home set in Vero Beach, Florida, which is where I live. And I wanted to have more female characters in my book than I wanted to have male characters, and that is the reason why the only male characters truly are Alex and Art, the painter. Okay. I wanted to have more female characters because, once again, I wanted to highlight the importance of female voices and how diverse we are, how different we are from one another, how we look at the same thing in many different ways.
Okay. And then you used fantasy. Why fantasy?
Well, imagination is freedom.
Imagination is freedom.
Yes, imagination is freedom. I attended school, of course. I went to high school. I have a bachelor's degree. I have 2 master's degrees. And you know what I realized once I started writing? My imagination was gone. It was all academic.
Academic, yeah, that happens.
Yes, I lost my imagination. I, for so many years, was told, okay, prove to me that this is a fact. Prove to me that this happened in my so I have to do that through my research, through my academic research. And then I became a mother, and I began reading children's books, stories, and to my children at night before bedtime. And slowly, little by little, book by book, I remembered, wait a second, this is beautiful. Yes, let's travel to a completely different world tonight, and let's go and fly on a dinosaur, or let's go and meet completely inexisting characters, at least in real life. Let's escape real life. So I found a sense of freedom and a sense of I guess in a way I went back to my childhood and all the stories and all the books I read as a child. So through me reading stories to my children, that's where I found myself as a 5-year-old, as a 6-year-old again. And that academic mindset that I lived with for decades finally was freed from restrictions and rules and regulations and having to prove facts that actually happened. I was free. I was free to travel to a completely different world. I was free to jump into a painting. I was free to create characters that perhaps existed, perhaps never existed. So I found so much freedom, and the freedom of also self-expression in my imagination through fantasy.
So what would you like to see? What do you hope for the future when you think of your books? Where would you like to see this book? Where would you like to see this book go?
I would love for this book to not just be it. As I said, A Stroke of Magic is a book series, much like the Magic Tree House. With every book, my characters are going to jump into a painting and keep discovering names and historical figures that have been lost to history amnesia for way too long. My illustrator and I are already working on book 2, and hopefully there's going to be book 3, book 4, and many, many others. What I want to do is I want to start a conversation. I want children to ask questions to their parents. I want their parents to say, oh my goodness, I never knew that. Let me learn more about it. A dear friend of mine who has always been very interested in dinosaurs and has studied so much about dinosaurs, he told me, I never knew about Mary Anning. And I read about everything that there was to know about dinosaurs before reading your book until I discovered about Mary Anning. And fortunately for us, now there are a few children's books highlighting Mary Anning and focusing exclusively on Mary Anning. The difference with my book is that I've done so in a brand new way. So she's not the main character of my children's book. She is the historical figure that the three protagonists discover. And also, one thing that I wanted to highlight is at the end of the story, Emmet, the magic paintbrush, he reminds the children that now they have a very important purpose, and that is to keep telling the story of Mary Anning. And I think it's important that we remember that the reason why Emmet tells the children to be the ones to keep telling the story is because, one, they're the future, and two, now they know the truth. And if there's one thing that children always do, whether it embarrasses us parents or not, is they always tell the truth.
This has been a very good and eye-opening book. I love dinosaurs, and as a child I read a lot about dinosaurs, and even as an adult I still watch the documentaries about dinosaurs, but I never heard of this lady. Never heard. Yeah, never. Because people just, you know, when they tell all these stories about dinosaurs, it's always men who are doing the discovering. It's always men who are naming, oh, we just discovered fossil here. We found bones here. It's always a man you see. The women are usually, I was watching a documentary on Egyptology, and I found it very interesting that some of the archaeologists were actually women. And they took time to interview these women, ask them about their findings and all of that. Most of the time it's just men. They'll interview the men, the women will be in the background. So most of the time I used to assume that those were just students. I didn't know that these were authorities in this field. So if people want to buy your book, where can they find your books to buy?
Definitely on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if they wish to have a signed copy, they can email me with a request at brunella@theitalianwriter.com.
Okay. I think we will put up your email when the video is posted, so that when people read your bio, they can find ways to contact you at the bottom.
Thank you.
So with this, I would like to say a very big thank you, Brunella, for this very eye-opening and enlightening chat. Now people who are listening know about your book. You guys know about Brunella, you know about ghostwriting. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's truly a privilege to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you more.